In the name of God, we swore an oath written not in ink, but in blood. The wind carried the words across the frozen plains of the north, words that would echo through centuries of conquest and faith. They called themselves the Order of Brothers of the German House of Saint Mary in Jerusalem. But the world would remember them by another name, the Teutonic Knights, born from piety, forged by crusade, and bound by an oath that demanded everything. Their story is not one of mercy, but of transformation. From healers to conquerors, from servants of God to masters of blood and steel. It began in the year 1190, as the Crusader banners fluttered above the battered walls of Acre. The Holy Land was burning. Christian armies from across Europe, French, English, and German, had come to reclaim Jerusalem after its fall to Saladin. The siege of Acre was merciless. Bodies lined the trenches. The wounded lay in heaps of dust and sand, and the sun turned their armor into ovens of agony. Amid this chaos, a small group of German pilgrims erected a tent of white cloth, embroidered with a black cross. They were not warriors, but men and women of compassion, nurses and monks who tended to the sick and dying. That humble tent would become the seed of something far greater. It was here, amid the screams of the wounded, that the Teutonic Order was born. At first, they were a hospital order, a community of caretakers serving German crusaders far from home. But the war never ended, and compassion, in the Holy Land, was never enough to survive. By 1198, as the Templars and Hospitallers grew in power, the German brothers took up arms. Their mission changed. Mercy gave way to militancy. Faith was no longer just healing, it was conquest, with papal blessing. The Order of Saint Mary became a military brotherhood. Their vows were absolute chastity, poverty, obedience, and unwavering devotion to the will of God. But this devotion had a darker side. In their hearts, they carried a sacred oath, a blood oath, sealed in iron, to fight until death for Christendom. It was both their purpose and their curse. The Teutonic Knights fought alongside other crusaders in the Holy Land, but by the early 13th century, the dream of Jerusalem was fading. The Saracens were stronger, and one by one, the Christian fortresses fell. The brothers looked to the horizon and saw not victory, but extinction. Yet fate and politics would soon open a new battlefield, one not of sand and stone, but of snow and forest. Far from the deserts of the East, in the heart of northern Europe, pagan tribes still worshipped their ancient gods. The Prussians, Lithuanians, and Livonians, peoples who still knelt before trees and fire, and who rejected the Christian cross. For the Church, these untouched lands were a stain upon Christendom. For the Teutonic Knights, they were opportunity. In 1226, the desperate Duke Conrad of Masovia in Poland invited the order to defend his lands from Prussian raids. He offered them a base, a small strip of land along the Vistula River, known as Comerland. To Conrad, they were allies. To the Teutonic Order, they were the first step to empire. With papal approval and imperial support, the knights marched north. White cloaks billowing in the cold wind, black crosses gleaming beneath the sun. Their Grand Master, Hermann von Salza, a diplomat of great cunning and loyalty to both Pope and Emperor, saw the future clearly. This would not be a temporary campaign. This would be the foundation of a state, a new Jerusalem in the north. They began their mission with zeal and discipline. One by one, the pagan strongholds fell. Villages were burned, shrines destroyed, and the survivors baptized in rivers turned red with blood. The knights called it conversion. The locals called it annihilation. In time, the Teutonic Order created a realm unlike any other in medieval Europe, a monastic state ruled not by kings or nobles, but by priests in armor. They called it the Ordensstadt, the state of the order. At its heart stood Marienburg, a fortress of red brick and stone, rising from the frozen banks of the Noget River. It became the center of their world, a holy citadel, and the symbol of their absolute faith. Life within its walls was governed by silence and prayer. Every knight was both soldier and monk. They ate in silence, slept on hard wood, and rose at dawn to the sound of the chapel bell. Their rule was simple: pray, serve, obey. To disobey was sin. To question was betrayal. To die in battle was salvation. They believed they were chosen, God's sword upon the earth, the hammer that would shatter the pagan world. But faith, when mixed with power, breeds something far more dangerous than zeal. It breeds destiny. By the mid-13th century, their war for the Baltic had turned into a holy crusade. Pope after pope declared indulgences for those who joined them. From across Europe, knights and nobles came, from Austria, Bohemia, and the German lands, drawn by faith, adventure, or the promise of land. The forests of Prussia became the stage of a new crusade, a crusade not of salvation, but domination. The old gods were hunted like beasts. The oak groves that once echoed with pagan chants were cut down to build churches. And where once the smoke of sacrifice rose to the sky, now rose the smoke of burning villages. But conquest has a price. The Prussian tribes fought back fiercely. For decades, the order's castles stood as islands of faith in a sea of rebellion. The war was slow, brutal, and unending. For every fort built, one was burned. For every tribe baptized, two revolted. Yet the order endured. They did not waver. Their blood oath held them fast. To die was gain. To conquer was divine will. And so, the Teutonic Order built not only castles, but legends. By 1283, the Prussians were finally subdued. Their leaders were dead, their temples gone, their names already fading from memory. The Teutonic Knights had done what the Church could not. They had Christianized an entire nation by sword. But in doing so, they had also become something no longer holy, a machine of conquest. They ruled their lands with iron discipline, dividing them into commanderies called conquerors, each governed by a knight, commander who answered only to the Grand Master. Taxes, law, justice, all were enforced by the order. No king ruled over them, no people elected them. Their word was divine command. They had built a kingdom of God without mercy. Yet even as they celebrated victory, their eyes turned further north and east, to the vast pagan lands of Lithuania, where the old faith still burned like an ember. Lithuania was no scattered tribe. It was an organized, fierce nation, led by warrior princes who refused both Rome and baptism. To the Teutonic Knights, Lithuania was the last frontier, the final pagan stronghold in Europe. To conquer it would complete their holy mission. To fail would mean their oath was broken. And so, they sharpened their swords once again. The Northern Crusades were reborn. For more than a century, the Teutonic Order launched campaign after campaign, riding through forests, burning villages, and capturing prisoners for forced conversion. They believed they were fighting for the soul of Christendom. But the longer the war dragged on, the more it became a war of pride and vengeance. The Black Cross no longer stood for mercy. It stood for power. The forests of the Baltic had fallen silent, but the Teutonic Knights hungered for more. Their banners now stretched from the Vistula River to the shores of the Baltic Sea. From their fortresses in Prussia, they looked to the east, toward Lithuania, a land untamed, proud, and fiercely pagan. The Lithuanian princes had resisted every attempt at conversion. They did not bow to Rome, nor to the cross. Their gods were the gods of thunder and fire, and their warriors fought not for salvation, but for freedom. To the Teutonic Knights, Lithuania was not merely another enemy. It was the last shadow of the old world. To destroy it was to complete God's work on earth. So began a century of war, a war without mercy, without rest, and without forgiveness. The knights rode under their black crosses through snow and blood, burning villages, destroying temples, and seizing captives who refused to kneel. Each campaign was called a crusade, each battle a step toward divine victory. But the Lithuanians fought like ghosts of the forest, striking fast, vanishing into the trees, and bleeding the order dry through endless raids. And as the years passed, something began to change within the ranks of the order. The purity of faith that once guided them was slowly replaced by ambition, wealth, and pride. Their crusade had become an empire, and empires are never satisfied. By the early 1300s, the Teutonic state had grown vast and rich. Trade flowed through their ports, silver filled their treasuries, and merchants from across Europe came to their cities. The order minted coins, built cathedrals, and commanded one of the most disciplined armies in Europe. But while their walls grew higher, their humility crumbled. They no longer served the church. They served themselves. The Grand Masters ruled like kings. Foreign knights came not for faith, but for glory. They carved their names into history with fire and sword, believing that conquest itself was holiness. Yet in their rise, they made a fatal mistake. They underestimated the power of those they had long despised. Because in the east, the pagans of Lithuania were uniting under a new ruler, a man who would soon change the balance of Christendom. His name was Grand Duke Vytautas, the Iron Wolf of the North. Under him and his cousin Jogaila, Lithuania forged an alliance with Poland, a union sealed by both politics and faith. Jogaila accepted baptism, becoming King Wisai Jajibao of Poland, and in doing so, he removed the Teutonic Knights' greatest weapon, the justification of holy war. No longer could the order claim they were fighting pagans. Now, they were fighting Christians, and yet they refused to stop. For the Knights, the union of Poland and Lithuania was an insult. To them, conversion meant surrender, and they would rather bathe in blood than yield their pride. So they marched once again, not as holy warriors, but as conquerors of a world that no longer needed them. The year was 1410, and on the fields of Grunwald, their destiny would be decided. The morning of the battle was heavy with mist. Thousands of men stood in silence, Poles, Lithuanians, and Tatars facing the might of the Teutonic order. The Grand Master, Ulrich von Jungingen, watched from atop his horse, his white cloak rippling in the wind. Before him, the enemy stretched like a sea, but he did not fear them. He had God, discipline, and the finest army in Europe. When the trumpets sounded, the Teutonic Knights charged like thunder. Their lances struck with devastating force, crushing the first lines of the Polish troops. For hours the battle raged, a storm of steel, fire, and dust. The knights fought with the fury of men who believed heaven itself watched their every strike. But the enemy did not break. The Lithuanians feigned retreat, then returned with renewed strength. The Polish banners rallied, and the field turned into chaos. As the sun reached its peak, the might of the Teutonic order began to falter. Their lines thinned, their formation shattered. And then, in the heat of the battle, the Grand Master himself fell, cut down by Polish blades, his blood soaking into the soil of Grunwald. By nightfall, the Teutonic order was broken. Thousands lay dead. Their banners were torn. Their castles, once thought impregnable, now trembled before the tide of defeat. The age of the Teutonic Knights had ended, not with glory, but with ruin. Yet their story did not vanish with that battle. The order survived, diminished, humbled, transformed from warriors to administrators, from conquerors to servants. They swore again to serve God, but this time without the sword. Their lands were lost, their power reduced to ceremony. The blood oath that once bound them had turned to dust, but its echo lived on, in their castles, their legends, and the fear their name still inspired. For centuries to come, the Black Cross of the Teutonic Order would remain a symbol of faith, of empire, and of the dangerous union between the two. History remembers them as both saints and sinners. To some, they were defenders of Christendom, disciplined, loyal, and devout. To others, they were tyrants who baptized nations in blood. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, in the fragile line between devotion and domination, between the light of faith and the shadow of fanaticism. Because in the end, the story of the Teutonic Knights is not just about war. It is about men who believed they were chosen, men who built an empire in God's name, and men who discovered that the cost of divine destiny is often paid in blood. They swore an oath in God's name and built a kingdom upon the bones of those who would not kneel. The Teutonic Knights believed they were chosen, that faith could justify empire, that blood could wash away sin. But history remembers differently. The ashes of Marienburg still whisper their truth, that even the holiest of men can be consumed by their own righteousness. If you stand where their castles once ruled, you can still feel the cold wind of their legacy, a silence heavy with victory and regret, because in the end, the Teutonic Knights didn't fall to enemies. They fell to the weight of their own faith. This was the rise and fall of the Teutonic Order, a brotherhood forged in devotion and undone by the very oath that made them eternal. How many empires since have walked the same path? How many still believe their cause is holy even when drenched in blood? History doesn't repeat itself, but it does echo. And those echoes are never silent. If you found truth in the shadows of their story, subscribe to Unsolved History. Because the past is never truly dead, it only waits for someone to remember.